My name's Bill Etchickson. I'm here from Google, and we're happy to have all of you here in our Brussels headquarters. It's 3 years ago, then Prime Minister Di Rupo stood here and announced a partnership between Google and the Mundaneum. And it was a small event, in the sense as small as you can have when a prime minister is involved. But we just agreed to do some conferences together and some events, because we saw a tie between what the Mundaneum did, or the Mundaneum founders did 100 years ago, and what Google is doing now, trying to organize and make accessible the world's information. And little by little, that partnership has grown. And we think it's important that the Mundaneum have access to the Brussels audience and to the European leaders and become what I think Otlet and La Fontaine, those two pioneers, Belgian pioneers, wanted, which was to influence all of Europe, indeed all of the world. So we're happy to offer the setting. Delphine and the Mundaneum arranged the entire event, but we're proud to be partners with the Mundaneum, not only in Mons, but here in Brussels. And we look forward to continuing to work with the Mundaneum so that their ideas, the ideas of these Belgian pioneers, can become better known and more widespread at a time when a lot of the issues they were talking about 100 years ago are again on the front pages. Access to information, copyright, peace and war through information, what content should be censored, what shouldn't be. These are all, I think, issues that these two pioneers dealt with and we're dealing with again. So thank you. I think I'm going to hand over the baton, the microphone, to Delphine, and eventually then to Alex, who I remember came here a couple years ago for the first time, and you all should really enjoy his wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So good night, everybody. First of all, thank you for being here tonight to listen to Alex and to meet also. I think we're lucky tonight because we have in the same room the three biographers of Paul Otlet, the founder of the Mundaneum. So we have the very first one who's coming from the other side of the planet, Poetry Ward, and I'm really happy he could be with us tonight. The second one, I would like to greet Françoise Lévy, who put Otlet forward in the 2000s with a documentary and a book. I would like to thank Google for this great partnership and this great opportunity to put Otlet and to highlight Otlet in Brussels. And we are setting this event up in a special place, in a special area in Brussels, because we are just now in front of the place where Otlet and La Fontaine collections were stored from the 40s to the 70s, so at the Parc Léopold. And it's also a special period of time because next week, the 10th of December, we'll celebrate the 70th anniversary of Otlet's passing. So everything is very symbolic today. And I wanted just to tell you about the Mundaneum that will reopen its doors next June with a brand new infrastructure, a brand new archive center, and a new exhibition also called Mapping Knowledge, Understanding the World Through Data. So thank you also to Alex for being with us tonight. I would like also to thank the partners, BELSPO, the Belgian Science Policy, in the context that we know it's, again, a big thank you we need to say today. And also to the University of Ghent, which is a great and precious partner on this event, but also on the exhibit we will present next year at the Mundaneum. So I will hand over to Peter Heutenhoven. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphine. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For universities, knowledge is the main working material. It goes without saying that the university's attention should go to the diffusion of knowledge and to the accessibility of it on the largest scale possible. This is not to say that all universities' knowledge is subject to universalism. And this is not to say neither that globalization should disdain local groundedness of universities. Paul Otlet's invention of documentation has disconnected knowledge from its material support, like books, drawings, and maps. In the same way, the notion of information has disconnected knowledge from its intellectual production and its political and social roots. Undoubtedly, Paul Otlet is for something, if not for a lot, in this revolution of documentation and information. He prepared the way for another type of society based on a universe of information, as his first biographer, Boyd Rayward, has put it in 1975. I remember being confronted as a beginning researcher more than 30 years ago with what was left of the archives of Otlet's Mundaneum, stocked somewhere in dark and dusty rooms in the Rue Rogier in Schaarbeek. The only light in the dark at that moment was Rayward's not yet well-known but monumental biography. Since then, Otlet has come a long way. The Mundaneum was given a second life in Mons. Several initiatives were taken. Otlet came to life again thanks to many articles, books, films, and exhibitions. And Otlet is now on his way to become a global hero. Ghent University's agency has collaborated to put Otlet again on the map of the history of information sciences. In the beginning of the 20th century, Ghent University's very respected head librarian, Ferdinand van der Hagen, had to deal with Paul Otlet and his innovatory theories. Van der Hagen offered resistance to Otlet's modernizing ideas on a worldwide bibliographic classification system and the use of cards. Two visions opposed. But we know that Otlet and his universal decimal classification overruled the traditional local inventories. Probably that moment around 1900 made that about a century later, Ghent University became a partner of the ambitious Google Books project. By the end of 2007, Google started digitizing 250,000 books of Ghent University Library. This will bring some of the greatest works of Dutch and French literature to millions of people globally through the Google Book Search Library project. Ghent University also contributed to the research on Paul Otlet and his role in the information society. In 2002 started a long-standing cooperation between the Mundaneum and Ghent University. At that moment, an international symposium on the architecture of knowledge was organized in the Mundaneum in Mons. Three other symposiums followed. One at the University of Urbana-Champaign, one in Ghent, and another one in Mons. Our cooperation continues in the Mundaneum's exhibition on mapping knowledge foreseen for 2015. On architects, the spatial aspects of Otlet's thinking exert special attraction. Otlet counted several architects among his friends as part of his network of intellectuals and scientists all over the world. Since several years, the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning of Ghent University is actively involved in studying Otlet. Doctoral research started, and in 2011, a first PhD was defended at Ghent University by Wouter van Acker on Universalism as Utopia, a historical study of schemes and schemas of Paul Otlet. For the first time, the enigmatic drawings of Otlet were analyzed and contextualized. In the framework of this research, Ghent University was very enthusiastic to offer a research funding and invite our colleague and friend Boyd Rayward for a semester to Belgium to continue his research on Otlet. Last year, the anniversary of the 1913 Ghent World Exhibition was celebrated. We know that Paul Otlet played a major role in the exhibition and in organizing the Premier Congrès International des Villes in Ghent. At that occasion, the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning and the Department of History edited a book to put forward the exhibition's modernity and its importance in the international networks. So as partner of the Munaneum and of Google, Ghent University is this evening very proud and excited to invite Alex Wright for his talk on Paul Otlet and the birth of the information age, and to broaden the scope on a figure our deep knowledge of whom only started. But I think I first can give the words and the floor to Boyd Rayward to say some words.
You notice that the academics always have some paper in their hand. I want simply to echo some of the remarks that have already been made, especially about the support of Google for the Mundaneum. I think that's been tremendously forward-looking and has helped Google, the Mundaneum to a new kind of existence that certainly the founders would have been excited about, proud of, and willing to drive it forward themselves. And being in this wonderful space is an expression of that new relationship. My task is to introduce Alex's book and to give it a little personal context, if I may. When nearly 40 years ago, I published my biography of Otlet, called The Universe of Information, the work of Paul Otlet for international organization and documentation. General network computing was in its infancy. The internet, the World Wide Web, Google, Wikipedia, to say nothing of personal computers, cell phones and the like, did not exist. When the internet and the World Wide Web began to emerge, I wrote a number of substantial, perhaps dryly scholarly articles about them in the early and mid-1990s, as in some way instantiating the ideas that Otlet had been writing about since the late 1890s. A young American journalist says that some 12 years ago, he, and I quote, stumbled across an article by Boyd Rayward that referenced an obscure Belgian bibliographer who envisaged something like the internet in the 1930s. In the years since then, this young journalist goes on to say, I have found myself gradually drawn in by the legacy of this brilliant, enigmatic, and at times maddeningly difficult character. A little later, in 2003, this same journalist wrote, one rainy afternoon in 1968, a young Australian graduate student named Boyd Rayward stepped into an abandoned office in the Park Leopold in Brussels, Belgium. Inside, he discovered a cluttered, musty, cobwebbed office into which the rain leaked, and one day flooded, causing the attendant then on hand to have a kind of epileptic seizure. Piled high to the ceiling were dusty stacks of books, files, manuscripts, the intellectual flotsam of a seemingly disorganized old scholar. He then goes on to discuss the work of this not so disorganized old scholar, Paul Otlet. And this office and the musty files and so on, my sense of direction is appalling. Wherever the Park Leopold is, just over here, it's 200 or 300 kilometers from this place. Meters. I mean meters, sorry. I'm used to dealing in foot and inches. Let me go on with my prepared remarks. Hitherto, the writings of this young journalist had found a home in the communications of the American Society for Computing, ACM, among other rather technical places. He was an expert on issues of computer architecture and web design, but he was from the first a journalist with a gift for clear, simple exposition of difficult ideas. Working at the New York Times, surely the summit of an American journalist's ambition, in 2008 he published an article called The Web Time Forgot. This is the web, a global network of information production and transmission as conceived by Paul Otlet. The article attracted enormous interest around the world, not least here in Belgium. In the article, the journalist was able to draw on a relatively recent major biographical study of Otlet. In 2002, the distinguished Belgian documentary filmmaker Françoise Levy had released her film on Paul Otlet titled The Man Who Wanted to Classify the World. It was in English, French, and Flemish. Its very storyline was Otlean. As Madame Levy and her assistant went through some recently discovered boxes of personal and other papers of Otlet, they were able gradually to piece together the details of his life and work. It was a major achievement both of detection, bibliography, biography, and of filmmaking. It won a number of awards and had an enthusiastic reception. The research on which it was based was so thorough and so important that it led Madame Levy to use it as a basis for a book that she published in 2006 with the same title, A Biography of Otlet. Our young American journalist drew especially on the film for its insights into Otlet, but also for some still images and clips for use in his New York Times article. Now, as our young journalist, who you all understand is Alex Wright, 12 years on from his first encounter with that article of mine, has produced Cataloguing the World, Paul Otlet and the Birth of the Information Age, published by a very distinguished press, the Oxford University Press. The book is about Otlet and his ideas, but it is also about how, and I quote, Otlet's work provides a window into a broader and larger, overlooked lineage of 20th century thinking about the possibilities of a networked world. The perspective Alex provides is a long one, perhaps prefigured in his earlier and also a very important book on the history of information systems. He called this succinctly, I love this title, Glut. In the new book, Cataloguing the World, we see, for example, Konrad Gessner in the mid-16th century with his Bibliotheca Universalis, too large, too heavy to tuck under his arm, rubbing shoulders with the Encyclopedists of the Enlightenment, before we come by way of the company of many others to Otlet, and through him to a list that I quote from Alex, later Anglo-American innovators like Vannevar Bush, Douglas Engelbart, Andy Van Dam, Ted Nelson, and Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. Alex's background in computer-based networking and web design, his work in and for some major computer companies, gives him a unique authority to deal with these remarkable men and their inventions and discoveries, and to explain the similarities and parallels with the work of Otlet. He has the technical understanding and the reporter's communicative gift to be able to explain simply but accurately to a general audience how the work of all of those whom he discusses created an intricate, essentially age-old, ever-changing, ever-present pattern of information systems and infrastructures in which he now is able to place Otlet clearly and to recognize his importance as part of that pattern. And yet his book is primarily about Otlet, so I present Alex to you with the echo of these words with which he sums up sensitively and comprehensively Otlet's importance. Otlet, he says, Otlet's work matters today, not just as a kind of historical curio, but because he envisaged a radically different kind of network, one driven not by corporate profit and personal vanity, but by a utopian vision of intellectual progress, social egalitarianism, and even spiritual liberation. I give you Alex.
Right, well, thank you, Boyd, for that introduction. I'm a little humbled to have somebody like Boyd Rayward speaking before me. He's the man who probably knows more about Paul Otlet than anybody on the planet. It's a little intimidating to get up here and try to say anything new about him. You know, I'm also very pleased to have people like Françoise Levy here, whose work, you know, as Boyd mentioned, was very important. And you know, it got me thinking a little bit. You know, so I wrote this book, and you know, books have this kind of illusion of completeness. You know, it feels like sort of a fixed thing, and it's got my name on it, and it's like, you know, like I wrote this. But, you know, the reality is, you know, I could not have written this book without Boyd, without Francois' work, without the work of hundreds of other books that I've consulted and lots of books I've read over the years. And I think anybody, you know, who sort of lives in the world we live in today of the network and, you know, this sort of constant sort of flow of information going back and forth, sort of, I think, intuitively understands that, you know, knowledge is a moving thing, and it's not really the property of, you know, of any one person. But the reason Otlet interests me is I think he had a deep insight into that long before it was quite as evident as it is today. And you know, if you really look deeply into the, you know, the way he thought about information, he really understood that, you know, he actually thought the book was a very sort of anachronistic sort of form, that really the interesting opportunities were trying to sort of unlock the contents of books and sort of create new forms of information that could, you know, take ideas from one book and connect them to ideas in another book or another piece of media, and you know, let new forms of knowledge flower over that. So I feel like, you know, for that reason, I feel like he's very, you know, increasingly relevant today in a way that maybe wasn't apparent during his time. And I think it's really thanks to people like Boyd that we can see just how relevant he was. I think Boyd was one of the first people to really see just how hypertext-like some of Otlet's ideas were. So let me just try to put him in context a little bit. And I will talk a bit about Otlet and give you sort of a brief sketch of his biography. But the reason I think Otlet is interesting is that I think he does give us this kind of window into understanding a period of time and a set of ideas that you know, are not often sort of understood as part of the conventional history of computer science or the internet. And so while I want to talk about Otlet, I also want to talk about sort of the ideas that that fed into his thinking and the historical context around that. And then I also want to talk a little bit about sort of how we can think about his ideas in relation to some of the phenomena we see happening today on the internet and elsewhere. So, so very briefly, this is Otlet in his later years. And I guess the sort of, you know, brief headline about, excuse me, about Otlet is that, you know, he's this sort of, you know, largely forgotten figure who invented something like the internet in the 1930s. And that's kind of the easy headline, and it's the one that you see in a lot of newspaper articles about him, including the one I wrote. I mean, it's sort of the easy hook to talk about Paul Otlet. But as I started learning more about him, I discovered there's really a lot more to the story than that. And his work really, you know, conveys a much more expansive vision of a world, a connected world, a more enlightened utopian world. And this idea of an information network was part of that, but it wasn't just about that. It wasn't just about sort of a pre-internet that he imagined. That was really just one piece of a much more interesting and complex puzzle. So I want to give you a little bit of a sense of that. Excuse me. But to really understand Otlet in context, I think we have to step back a little bit further in time. You know, Otlet's big sort of project through most of his life was to create this universal bibliography of all the world's information. It was something he started early on in his life and spent a great deal of time with his partner, Henri Lafontaine, working on. But he was not the first person to have an idea like that. Over the years, there have been many other institutions, you know, individuals who've had this dream of organizing all the world's information. You could certainly look at the Library at Alexandria. You could go even further back to ancient Sumeria. You could look at the Imperial Library of China under the Emperor Shi Huangdi. King Charlemagne tried to do something like this. The Vatican Library. There have been many, many attempts at trying to like some sort of taps into some deep human desire, I think, for sort of comprehensive knowledge. This notion of trying to collect the world's information. But what's interesting about Otlet is not just that he wanted to do that, but the particular technique that he came up to try to accomplish that mission, I think is quite interesting and quite relevant to some of the challenges that we're thinking about today as we sort of struggle with the problem of information overload in the world. So to go back a little bit, I think Otlet's sort of clearest intellectual ancestor was a guy named Konrad Gessner. He was a Swiss naturalist who worked in the mid-16th century. And he was really primarily spent a lot of his work on a lot of his time working on botany. He tried to sort of catalog all of the world's, all of the sort of plants that he could find. And in the process of doing his research, he came up with a very interesting technique. He started taking notes on pieces of paper and then taking those pieces of paper and then cutting them up into slips, into little slips, and then organizing those slips. There's a fantastic book by Marcus Krzyzewski called Paper Machines where he talks about this. And Gessner's approach was, it was a really kind of revolutionary approach, even though it sounds like a very simple idea, just taking your notes and putting them on little slips of paper. If you think about it, the history of books up until that time, books had been a very linear proposition back to when there were like papyrus scrolls and then later the more traditional sort of codex book. But books were kind of written in a long narrative. And he had this idea of chunking that information into usable little nuggets that he could then put together in other interesting ways. And this is how he produced his great reference books. But he eventually had the idea of taking that idea a step further to create a universal bibliography of everything that had ever been published. And so using this technique of little cut-up paper slips, he began to try to collect bibliographical information about every known piece of knowledge, every book, every article that had ever been published. And he came quite close, and he basically used this sort of paper slip technique to do that. So that was in the 16th century. The years that followed, Gessner's technique actually began to attract other people who became interested in adapting that technique, one of which was the philosopher Leibniz, who came up with this idea of a memory cabinet. He was a sort of obsessive note-taker who, anytime a thought would occur to him, or he read something interesting in a book, or he had an interesting conversation with somebody, he would use Gessner's technique. He would write it on a little slip of paper, and then he would put it in a great filing cabinet that looked something like this. It was called a memory cabinet. It was almost like a sort of flat file database where he could basically take his information and file it and then retrieve it when he needed it. So this kind of paperslip technique was starting to get some traction over the years. And as the years progressed, people sort of played with it and came up with other innovations. A librarian named Rosier of the French Academy of Science came up with the idea of using playing cards, which at the time were for a long time, playing cards were only printed on one side, and so they were often used as sort of note cards or business cards. And what was interesting about playing cards is that they were of a standard size, and they were fairly durable and firm. And so you could actually think about putting them sort of in a drawer, and flipping through them. So that was sort of the origin of the card catalog, was this idea of taking Gessner's technique and then putting it on sort of firm cardboard that you could then use in a little more of a scalable way. So there's just a little bit of historical backdrop to how the idea of a card catalog evolved. And I think today, we may think of card cataloging as kind of this, this old, antiquated technique, but it's actually a very sophisticated approach. I mean, it is something like a computer database idea. And I'll talk a little more about sort of how card cataloging actually is sort of deeply interwoven into the history of computing. As we start getting into the late 19th and early 20th century. But as we got into the 19th century, a few other interesting developments started to happen. First was the Industrial Revolution, of course. And during that period, one of the early sort of attempts at creating an industrial production machine actually involved the printing press, which up until this time, even though the printing press had been around for 400 odd years at that point since Gutenberg, it really had not progressed very much. The printing press was still a very manual operation. It involved a kind of corkscrew press, like a wine press, and to print a book was a very time-consuming operation. You had to take one sheet at a time, set the type by hand, screw down the press, get one sheet, get another sheet, then cut it up. I mean, even though it was a lot faster than writing manuscripts by hand, it was still a very slow process, and books were still actually quite expensive. By the late 18th century, a reasonably well-to-do middle-class household might own one or two books. Like, they were that expensive. And there were a few, like, more wealthier people who might have a private library of, maybe 20 books. And there were very few, like, really big libraries, really just kind of big universities, the Vatican, the Sorbonne, the British Library. But there really wasn't much of a need for a very sort of complicated cataloging system because there just weren't all that many books to deal with. But as the 19th century progressed, the technology of printing began to accelerate, and at the same time, the raw materials became much cheaper. Paper was now being produced on sort of cheap rag pulp, which was much more affordable, drove down the cost of production. The technology accelerated, and at the same time, as people, especially in Northern Europe, started moving to growing urban centers, they started to receive public education, and we had this growing literate population with some disposable income and this kind of growing supply of affordable literature. So you saw the beginnings of the mass media starting to happen during this period. You saw the first daily newspapers, you saw popular magazines, the popular novel started to really find an audience in the mid-19th century. And inside of organizations, companies and governments started producing things on paper at an unprecedented rate. They started producing reports and documents and all kinds of. So there was this sudden sort of information explosion that really happened in the mid to late 19th century. And we may think of the information explosion as being a recent phenomenon, but I would argue it actually started much earlier, and it was really a direct outcome of industrialization. And so it was during this era that librarians really started to wrestle with the problem of, what do you do with all this information, and are these older cataloging systems really going to be up to the task? And so this was one sort of important trend that was developing in the world at the time that Otlet came into the world. Another important trend was the growth of networks. So the industrial era was also the era in which we started to see communication networks sort of circling the globe. So you had the telegraph, you saw postal networks. For the first time you were able to send mail between countries, which was not an easy thing to do before. Suddenly that became a much more straightforward thing. Railways. Belgium was one of the first great railway networks, along with Great Britain. And so this whole notion of the network became an important conduit, not just for people and goods, but also for ideas. These new publications that were being created, journals and books, were now flowing across national borders, as were people. And so there was this kind of global exchange of ideas happening that was leading to some interesting sort of experiments. In Hungary, in the late 19th century, they created this a sort of telephone newspaper using sort of an early audio network where they would hire somebody to actually read the newspaper every day, and you could have it piped into your hotel or your office. In Paris, they had a thing called the Théâtrophone, which was basically a streaming music device that let you get a live broadcast of the Paris Opera to your living room. Proust was a big fan of this. And also in Paris, they had an incredible infrastructure for this massive pneumatic tube network that went through under the streets of Paris. It was run by the Postal Service. My friend Molly Steenson gives a great presentation on this. So the networks were really starting to change the way information was exchanged around the world. And excuse me. So it was in this world that the problem of cataloging and storing and managing this information was coming to the fore. So people like Melville Dewey in the United States created one of the early card cataloging system called the Dewey Decimal System, which would eventually become the basis for Otlet's system. And interestingly, Dewey saw this as not just a tool for sort of libraries, but he also saw it as something that organizations would use, companies and governments would use to manage their information. So he saw the card catalog, again, as a kind of database. He actually started a company called the Library Bureau that created office equipment, including these cataloging systems. And the idea was that he hoped that by creating sort of standardization and protocols and systems, it would be possible for organizations of all stripes to sort of make information flow more efficiently in all kinds of different contexts. Interesting footnote, the Library Bureau was entered into a partnership with a company that eventually became IBM and was actually deeply interested. The card cataloging business became part of IBM's sort of partnership very early on, and some of that heritage, I think, ultimately led to the development of the punch card and the database and everything that followed after that. So anyway, so this is all background. So this is the world that Paul Otlet was born into. So here's Paul Otlet as a young man. Very brief biographical sketch. He was born in Brussels in 1868 to a middle-class family, a fairly well-off, upper middle-class family. His mother died when he was very young, and his father was a kind of an entrepreneur who's traveled the world selling tram systems to other cities. So Otlet had a very interesting childhood. He grew up, was largely educated by tutors. His father didn't want to send him to a traditional school for a long time, so his family also had spent a lot of time on an island in the Mediterranean. So he had a very kind of interesting, unusual childhood. Eventually, he did go to school as a teenager and was, by all accounts, a very shy, very introverted, very bookish young man who was given a job managing the school library. And he became really intrigued with books. The books he really felt like were his best friends. He became like very engulfed in things like encyclopedias. He was obsessed with the encyclopedia and really started to think deeply about how all this information could be connected. So as a teenager, he created his own classification system. This is from the Mundaneum archives. And this is from his personal journal. He was thinking very early on about this question of this is how he would organize his own notes and came up with his own sort of personal system. When he finished school, he went on to university, and then under some pressure from his father, he went on to become a lawyer and joined a law firm. Quickly realized that that was not the life for him, decided he was not happy or fulfilled being a lawyer. But during his time at the law firm, he did meet a very important person who would become his partner and collaborator for most of the rest of his life, Henri Lafontaine, who was a bit older than him, was also working in the same law office of a guy named Edmond Picard. And together, one of the projects they worked on was to compile it was a compilation of all of Belgian law, was the big project they worked on. And excuse me, they worked together on that project, and they discovered a kind of affinity for this problem of sort of organizing and indexing and figuring out how to collect and distribute information. So they began to move on to other interesting topic areas. They both had an interest in sociology and the sociological literature and began to explore how to create a sort of bibliography within that topic space. And within a few years, they had started to really broaden their horizons. They began to think much more ambitiously about the possibility of organizing information across all topics. And they began this project, which they called the Universal Bibliography, which was an attempt to, eventually, they framed it as an attempt to collect bibliographical information about everything that had ever been published. So they started this project in the 1890s. Otlet wrote a very important essay called Something About Bibliography during this period, which kind of laid out a lot of his thinking about the possibilities of organizing information. And this is where he started to develop some of his really original insights about the limitations of books and the possibilities of sort of connecting ideas between books and sort of recombining information in interesting new forms. In 1900, Otlet and Lafontaine took their idea and exhibited it at the World Expo in Paris in 1900, which was, as I was doing research, I found it was just a fascinating event. It was the largest such event ever organized. Something like 50 million people came to this event, and they basically cleared a huge portion of central Paris to make room for these exhibits. And they had, like many countries, had their own sort of pavilions that were built of plaster of Paris that were very sort of temporary structures. And they had these grand, what they called palaces of, devoted to things like industry and manufacturing. And for a lot of people coming to this, it must have been an incredibly eye-opening experience. This was they had a palace of electricity. And this was the first place a lot of these people were seeing like electric lights, moving pictures. Edison was there, escalators and moving sidewalks. And I think often like to think of ourselves as living in this period of rapid innovation, but really the late 19th century was a period of just incredible disruptive technological progress. It's hard to even imagine what it must have been like to come from a kind of candlelit world into this spectacle and see electric lights and moving pictures and things for the very first time. It's hard to even imagine what a shock that must have been or how exciting that must have been for people. But Otlet and Lafontaine were right there, and they were exhibiting their demonstration of the Universal Bibliography. And it was very well received. They made some very interesting, important connections there. They actually won one of the grand prizes at the World Expo when they left. And soon after that, they were able to, they developed some momentum, and they were actually able to persuade the Belgian government to fund their project and to try to really try to accomplish their ambition. So in the years that followed, Otlet really started to, and LaFontaine started to really sketch out their ideas in a lot more detail about how a system like this might work. And this was really, I think, where Otlet started to make his major contribution to the to information science, or documentation, as he called it. So this is an interesting diagram, one of Otlet's sketches that I think kind of lays out the thinking in a very nice visual way. So the idea is there's a card catalog. The card catalog has cards on it, and the cards contain information that's pulled out of books. The books have ideas that come out of people's heads that have strange little things popping out of their heads. But the key to it was the card catalog, which at the time was sort of the state-of-the-art information storage technology. Here's another sort of diagram that illustrates the same concept. But the key to this was this innovative system that Otlet developed called the Universal Decimal Classification, which is still in use in many libraries in Europe. And what's really so interesting and sophisticated about it, it takes some explaining, but it's sort of a synthetic language for describing topics in a minute level of detail. So it builds on the Dewey Decimal System, which is a fairly simplistic system for assigning a numerical code to a topic. Like you have the topic of history, and that has like a code associated with it. Or you can have science or religion or that sort of thing. But Otlet took, and there's some subdivisions, but it's all very, in the Dewey system, it's all very hierarchical. You know, one topic contains another topic, contains another topic, contains another topic. Otlet's big leap was to create this syntax for describing much more nuanced gradations of meaning between things. So he came up with this idea of what he called basically these punctuation marks, basically using punctuation marks as a kind of language extender. So things like colons and quotation marks and parentheses that would just allow you to assert kind of semantic relationships between topics. So you could get down to a very precise level of detail to say, you know, this is a book about, you know, monetary policy in 16th century Spain or something. And by getting to that level of detail, you could then create what he called links between documents and other sources, so that it created this language that would allow you to follow a thread, you know, a topical thread between multiple books. So it was a very it eventually evolved into a very sort of hypertext-like idea. But the key insight was that, you know, by having such precision, you would be able to extract, almost in the same way a search engine works, you would be able to scan a corpus of text and pull out the topics, and then you know, span across a number of topics, and then pull that information together and represent it in some interesting new form. So this was no small undertaking. It took years for them to build. Eventually, this is a snapshot of what the bibliography looked like at one point, and these are some of the staff that they were able to hire to do the work. Eventually, the catalog grew to something like 16 million individual index cards that were all cataloged by hand from all available sources. And their vision expanded to encompass more than just books. They began to look at things like journal articles. They began a project to create an archive of newspapers. He began to look at posters and audio recordings, and eventually moving pictures, and began to think of this as in a much more multimedia kind of way, of thinking about how you could collect information across a whole bunch of different forms and still have it be available in a more consistent, organized fashion. But again, there was a little more to it than that. It wasn't just about, I mean, this was one, of course, major project, but at the same time, Otlet and LaFontaine were also very interested in sort of the organizational layer of things as well. At the time, there was a movement towards, there were a growing number of international associations being formed, scholarly associations and other kinds of topics. And this was partly an effect of the growing sort of networked nature of information flowing around the world, that people who had shared interests could begin to form associations across national boundaries. So you could have a society of chemists with members in different countries, or you could have Marxists who communicated through journals and through other associations. And there were all kinds of international associations starting to form. And interestingly, a lot of them chose to meet in Brussels. Brussels became a real hotbed of the international congresses during this period. A lot of these growing organizations found Brussels, and Brussels sort of went after them and felt like this was a good location. Belgium at the time was positioned itself as a neutral country and felt like it was a good, had a very welcoming, kind of receptive approach. And Otlet and Lafontaine wanted to create sort of an association of associations. So they created something called the Union of International Associations that was sort of an organizing body for all these associations. And this was actually sort of connected to the idea of the universal bibliography. The idea was that there was sort of coordination at an organizational layer, and a lot of the information they were trying to collate and organize, a lot of it was flowing out of these organizations through scholarly journals and other kinds of publications, and they felt like they wanted to have kind of expert curation of particular topics, so that the way you classify information about chemistry should be sort of coordinated with the society of chemists, right? And so that there would be a kind of standards body that would help to control the vocabulary and the indexing and the cataloging standards around these things. So this was a big part of the vision, is that there was an organizational layer to all of this that over time really evolved quite a bit. Otlet also began to think in other directions as well. One of the people he'd met at the Paris World Expo was a guy named Patrick Geddes, who was a Scotsman, very fascinating guy. He's very hard to pin down. He had a background in biology, but he was really sort of better known as a sociologist. And he also was very interested in museums. He had this public attraction in Edinburgh called the Outlet Tower that involved, it's still there, it has something called a camera obscura, if people know what that is. It's a device that lets you look in real time, like through a series of mirrors, so that you can get a sort of almost like a video streaming image of what's going on outside, and you could point the camera around. It was really quite a popular and innovative attraction. That the invention goes back to ancient Greece, but Geddes was, felt like it was a very interesting way of getting people engaged in the question of sort of looking beyond their immediate world and sort of pointing the camera at, like, he was in Edinburgh, so you could look at the surrounding countryside, or you could look at the slums, or you could look at other neighborhoods, and then he used that as a way to get people interested in the topic of exploring the connection between the immediate experience people had of living in the world and the larger world of ideas, and sort of expanding their view outward to the world at large. So Geddes and Otlet had a very lively correspondence. They influenced each other quite a bit. Geddes created these really interesting, what he called thinking machines. They're these sort of information diagrams. So, Geddes was a big believer in sort of cross-disciplinary work. He felt like there was sort of too much fragmentation going on in the scholarly world, and too many people being sort of narrowly focused on this topic or that topic, and he really wanted to create frameworks for the disciplines to sort of talk to each other. So he created these interesting sort of conceptual mapping tools to sort of map out the relationships between ideas. And Otlet got very interested in the whole question of the possibilities of museums and sort of creating, taking some of his ideas about organizing information and bringing it into physical, three-dimensional space. So eventually, he and Lafontaine persuaded the Belgian government to support them in creating what they called the Palais Mondial, which was a vastly ambitious project. It was meant to be a kind of universal museum that covered sort of every topic in the world. They had, eventually it grew much bigger than this, but it was, they had sort of dedicated exhibits about all kinds of different topics, from like mathematics to, astronomy to, to the history of every country in the world. And for Otlet, this was also sort of connected to the bibliography project. His idea was that he felt that museums had the possibility of really being kind of active learning centers, and they could also be almost like kind of interfaces to knowledge that could then bring people in at a high level to sort of get exposure to a topic that then, if they chose to, they could explore in further detail by drilling into the universal bibliography. He also later on worked very closely with a guy named Otto Neurath, the Austrian philosopher, who did a lot of interesting work around the possibilities of museums as sort of educating workers and having a much more active sort of social role. But this is a sort of a glimpse inside the Palais Mondial. What's interesting is it doesn't look like a conventional, what we might think of as a typical museum. It's not really a collection of historical objects or artifacts or paintings or that sort of thing. It's really a place to consume information in large part. And a lot of the exhibits were these sort of involved these kind of information diagrams. And his idea was that eventually these exhibits could be syndicated to other museums, and there could be a sort of network of museums, maybe with expertise in one topic who would then syndicate their information to other topics. So it was kind of like almost like a publishing network among museums. He did have some artifacts. This was a telegraph room that included a lot of sort of interesting artifacts of telegraph machines and other sort of technology at the time. He also came up with these very interesting sort of three-dimensional interfaces. I'm not even quite sure what this thing does, but it looks cool. And these are some, he also partnered with some designers and artists to create these sort of very multimedia-like interfaces. This, I think, is one of the best examples. It really, I think, shows you how the way he was starting to think about sort of incorporating words and images. Taking images and then taking just very tightly written, very sort of chunked little pieces of content that can give you just a very high-level overview of a topic that then you could explore in further detail if you wanted to. It really starts to feel almost like a computer interface. So these were some of the major sort of initiatives that Otlet was starting to pursue. The Universal Bibliography, the International Union of Associations, the Palais Mondial. But as the years went by the in the years just before World War I, he entered into another interesting partnership with a guy named Hendrik Christian Andersen. A very interesting, kind of eccentric figure. He was a sculptor by training, and but eventually he developed this kind of interesting idea about creating a world city. He wanted to create this kind of utopian capital of the world, sort of, like would be like the center of this new kind of post-national world government. And he worked with an architect, Ernest Eberhard, to create these architectural drawings, which also featured his sculptures in the middle of them, conveniently. But he and Lafontaine, and Otlet and Lafontaine came in contact with each other and discovered there was kind of a kinship of ideas here. While they were thinking about the sort of world of ideas and how to make that more accessible and how to organize things, what Andersen was thinking about was kind of a related concept of trying to organize the world in a sort of civic center. And they entered into an active collaboration for several years where they were trying to think about how they could help each other. At one point, it looked like they were going to try to convince the Belgian government to actually dedicate space in Belgium to build this world center. They actually had identified a piece of land. By this time, I should mention Lafontaine was a Belgian senator and was quite influential. And they really started to explore this idea very actively. And the idea would be that the Universal Bibliography and the museum and the Union of Associations would all be headquartered here, along with a university and at the sort of meeting place for the world's governments. The Olympics would be hosted here. I mean, it was a really kind of outrageous, crazily ambitious idea. But I think the backdrop here is that in the 19th century, there was this growing movement towards internationalism, even as sort of tensions between some of Europe's nations were starting to emerge. There was also at the same time a very optimistic and growing movement towards this kind of international ethic, this idea of like fostering international cooperation, and that this might be the hope for transcending some of the historical rivalries between nation states. And Otlet was a big proponent of this, as was Andersen, as were a lot of other people in the years leading up to the First World War. So they began to sort of sketch out ideas of how they could collaborate. Otlet promoted the world city at the Palais Mondial. He has a little sort of diorama of it here. And eventually they began to pursue the idea. And obviously things were interrupted by the war. At the end of the war, Otlet tragically lost one of his sons during the war, but that experience really left him feeling even more committed to the cause of world peace and strengthened his idealism in some ways. And he really decided this was really where he wanted to dedicate his efforts going forward. He briefly kind of resumed the collaboration with Anderson. For a while, Otlet was a very active proponent of the League of Nations during the war and was recognized as one of the sort of early polemicists or writers who was promoting the idea of the League of Nations when the League of Nations was actually formed. And he was very hopeful when that happened that this might finally be the opportunity to realize his grander vision for the world city, for this coordinated infrastructure for the world's information and the world's organizations. He was very hopeful for a while that the League of Nations would become that. Eventually, he became disillusioned. He felt like he and Anderson both felt like it lost the opportunity. It became much more of a bureaucratic kind of structure where nations were more kind of jockeying for position and protecting their own interests. And you feel like the idealism, the opportunity was kind of lost. Anderson eventually kind of threw up his hands and walked away and said he didn't want anything to do with the League of Nations anymore. But Otlet pressed on and eventually, in the 1920s, struck up a collaboration with Le Corbusier, the great French-Swiss architect, and resumed his thinking about the world city and sort of a new approach. He and Le Corbusier began to collaborate on diagrams for a sort of new incarnation of this. And Le Corbusier had actually attempted to had actually submitted a plan for the League of Nations headquarters, which eventually was located in Geneva. Brussels had hoped to win the headquarters. Otlet was very disappointed when they didn't. But Le Corbusier, unfortunately, did not get the contract to do the League of Nations headquarters. It was a long story, but he was still very committed to the idea, and he and Otlet struck up a really active partnership for a while and began to promote their ideas anew and came up with sort of a new vision of the world city. And at this point, Otlet began to began using a new term to talk about his vision for this information, this sort of center of information. He began to use the term the mundaneum, which was a kind of made-up Latin-sounding word. But he began to really write more deeply about it. And as the years went by, as it got into the 1930s, he started to, his efforts were beginning to kind of lose steam in the kind of real world. The Belgian government had withdrawn support for the Palais Mondial. He was beginning to sort of withdraw a little bit. And by the mid-1930s, he was really sort of refocusing his energy more inward and starting to really think more deeply about some of these ideas he had spent his life pursuing, and began to write what really became his most important works, the treatise on documentation and a book called Monde, where he began to really look ahead in a more futuristic way to the possibilities of what this world of connected information might be. And it was during this period that he started to kind of look at some emerging technologies like television, radio, microfilm, and started to see some new possibilities taking shape. And he began to really think about this idea of what he eventually called the televised book, the idea that you could maybe have a book stored remotely that could be projected on a screen somewhere, and that those books could be connected to other books, and that potentially one day, someone sitting in his armchair would have access to all the world's information. He also began to think about the possibilities of sort of televised lectures, or what we might today call distance learning, or university courses being presented at a great distance through television screens. And he also had this idea that all these different kinds of media that were emerging might eventually sort of converge into a new form, under the auspices of the mundaneum, this new kind of universal repository of information that would be accessible to anyone. And so you can see that in this diagram, he sees like different types of media sort of becoming available and then being distributed to a broader audience. As the years went by, he started to continue to evolve his thinking. He prototyped this idea of what he called the Mondothèque, which was sort of a prototype, almost like a workstation. It's almost like this notion of a terminal where you could create a kind of customized local collection of information. It would be connected with a radio transmitter, and you could eventually, sort of create your own customized collection from a larger body of knowledge that would be, you could sort of and tap into the storehouse of the mundaneum and then create a very topical collection of information that was of interest to you. Interestingly, an artist, a Belgian artist, recently tried to built a reconstruction of the Mondothèque that was on display in the Mundaneum in Mons for a while. I don't know if it's still there or if it will still be there when they reopen. Maybe Delphine knows. Anyway, but it was pretty close. So Otlet really started to think in terms of like the possibilities of a network and this connected set of institutions. This is a diagram that I think kind of lays out his broader vision for the Mundaneum. The idea is there's the world city, and there are these kind of, the Mundaneum becomes, he talks about it in different ways at different times. In some ways it's this collection of information, in other ways it's a kind of intellectual layer that helps to, sort of a layer of ideas that, that helps create a sort of shared understanding for humanity. And then he also talks about it eventually in spiritual terms, even as an environment in which humanity could start to realize its true potential, achieve spiritual awakening. So it's a very kind of interesting, kind of interwoven set of concepts at work here. But I think the key point is it's not just about a sort of, search engine sort of idea, even though that's in there. It's a much more expansive, much more interwoven vision of a connected world. So towards the end of Otlet's life, he begins to think even further ahead to the possibility of wireless networks. He begins to think through how like information could flow through something like radio waves and be through a sort of central transmitter, and that this would further sort of revolutionize the flow of information around the world. This is one of his last drawings. And then finally, here's Otlet towards the end of his life. Even though his work really kind of essentially lost momentum sort of in the real world in the 1930s, and then was delivered a kind of crushing blow with World War II when the Nazis came and really actually destroyed quite a bit of his work. And he died in 1944, and a lot of his work had sort of wound down at that point. But he was still dreaming and still harboring this cherished dream of the world city, of this kind of idealized idealized world that he thought would one day come to pass. So again, Otlet was, for many years, kind of fell out of view. There was actually still a core group of admirers of his in Brussels who met regularly. This sort of a friend society who sort of tried to preserve his legacy for a while. And he was still known somewhat in library science circles. But really, kind of lost, fell from view for quite a while until Boyd Rayward sort of picked up his paper trail and began the long project of sort of resurrecting his legacy. But even in the 1960s and 70s, Otlet, I think, was seen as sort of an interesting figure in the library science world. But it wasn't really until the internet happened and the web came along that I think people were able to sort of reevaluate him and see the real sort of far-sighted nature of some of his ideas. So I want to just spend a minute talking about, well, what were those ideas, and did Otlet really sort of invent the web? Well, the short answer is no. The truth is that the people who actually invented the internet and the web had, as far as I've been able to determine, not actually heard of Paul Otlet. But that does not make his ideas any less interesting or important. And in fact, I think they make them even more sort of enticing, in that it's this alternative vision of how things could be. And I want to just spend a little bit of time sort of reflecting on the ways in which it's different and the ways in which it's similar to what we see today. So I think one of the big differences with Otlet's vision and the web as we know it today, this is a map of the sort of topology of the internet. The internet is famously flat. There's no top. The people who invented the web, people like J.C.R. Licklider and Doug Engelbart and the people at DARPA, they very intentionally designed a network that had no central control point. There's a popular myth that it was designed to withstand a nuclear attack. That's not actually true, but it is true that it was developed by some very iconoclastic people who did not want to have any sort of single point of failure on the network. And so from the very beginning, it's been this topology of a very distributed, networked infrastructure where there's no control point. And that in itself is a very different world from the world Otlet imagined. He really, as much as he was committed to the idea of universal access and a global repository of information, he also saw it as a very controlled environment. He saw it as there being an institution, a central institution that kind of managed it, and that there would be a classification system, a way of cataloging information, and a way of sort of ensuring its integrity and its quality that involved, a large number of sort of paid staff sort of filtering that information and making sense of it. So that was, a very critical and important difference. But that said, he did use the term network, quite a bit, or so, and he did see the possibilities of networks for sort of exchanging information. But I think the key point is that it wasn't just this total self-organizing thing. There was kind of at least a coordinating point. For better or worse, I'm not saying, Otlet's vision. I think one of the keys to the success of the web is that it is so open. Anybody can. The barriers to entry are very low. It's very easy to start a business or put up a website, and that's the reason I think it's been so successful and has spread so widely. But the reality is that for a lot of us, that's the experience of it, right? Otlet's world probably would not have had a lot of room for cat pictures or social networking, frankly. One of the things I think Otlet and a lot of the other early sort of hypertext visionaries did not imagine was the role of sort of ordinary individuals in publishing and the sort of social aspect of things. He did talk briefly about the idea of sort of people applauding in the chorus if they saw something they liked, but he didn't really have an idea that people would publish their own articles or books and share them all over the place. That just wasn't really part of the vision. It was much more about information sort of flowing through sort of gatekeepers that would help ensure its quality. But nonetheless, it was meant to be much more open and accessible to anybody. It's just not that everyone would be a publisher. I think it's also worth reflecting a little bit, given where we are. Oh, thank you. That's just what I appreciate it. I so needed that. I was just thinking. Certainly I think the closest parallel you could say to what Otlet imagined was something like Google. Like he certainly, at one point actually, the Mondaneum offered a service where you could send in a query by telegraph for a fee. And I think it was like 4 francs or something. And then a staff member would go and look up the answer to your question and telegraph it back to you. So pretty Googly kind of idea, except for the fee, I guess. But there are also some important differences. Google's search engine really works. In some ways, it's certainly there's a lot of information there, but the algorithm is a proprietary product. I think that the big difference with Otlet's vision is, as much as it was a very controlled system, it was also a very transparent system. The classification system, the UDC, would be kind of visible to anyone, and you'd be able to see, how things were organized and, why they appeared, where they did in a sort of class. It was much more of a sort of taxonomy structure and much less of this kind of keyword structure. That said, there are some interesting parallels when we look at the world of kind of linked data and some of those movements, which I know Google's doing some interesting work in. But there are important differences. It was not really this kind of search engine, but I think the sort of potential benefit to the user was very similar. When you look at something like Amazon, also in some ways a sort of Otlet-like idea, a repository of the world's books. It's interesting to note that Otlet's vision really didn't have any commercial activity to speak of. He actually did see kind of a small role for bookstores, but it wasn't primarily something that was driven by commercial interest. It was really meant to be a much more idealistic tool for scholarship and understanding, and it was very much like sort of a quasi-governmental nonprofit environment for sort of intellectual progress and understanding. So it wasn't. He didn't really see it as something that would be driven out of the private sector so much. And if we think about Facebook, certainly again, he didn't really see the possibilities of social networking as we would think about it today. Although he did think there'd be streaming video at some point. But probably the closest thing to what Otlet had in mind was something like the semantic web, which has had an interesting history since it was first proposed by Tim Berners-Lee. I think it's had had some interesting progress in some areas and has sort of maybe failed to catch on in a more widespread way. But it really does share a lot of the sort of principles of Otlet's ideas. I mean, the semantic web is very much about, for anyone who doesn't know, it's the idea of a web that's designed to encourage sort of machine-to-machine communication by having what are called ontologies, or sort of controlled vocabularies in particular domains, so that the chemists can just define an ontology for that information space, and then information in that domain can then be organized and cross-referenced much more easily. So there's a lot of interesting, I think, parallel there, and I think has some of the same problems. I mean, it's actually very hard to imagine building something like the Mundanam today. I mean, that level of control, the level of institutional infrastructure behind it, very hard to imagine sort of the governance model of how it would, in today's world, how that would really work. But the semantic web, I think, is that movement is in some ways trying to achieve the same thing, and is running into some of those kinds of barriers, I think, in terms of figuring out what is the sort of governance model for it. But the spirit of it and the potential benefit of it is very similar. But broadening our focus a little bit, I think it's also worth remembering that, again, Otlet's idea was not just about organizing information, although that was sort of at the core of it. He also saw this, this is part of a much larger project involving a more utopian world society. So I think, given that we're here in Brussels, certainly worth noting, I think, that the whole European Union project is very much, I think, an evolution of this internationalist kind of ideal, for all its sort of ups and downs. I mean, this notion of creating a federation of states is a very Otletian kind of idea. And looking even further afield, something like the United Nations, certainly, in the aftermath of World War II and after the sort of failed experiment of the League of Nations, the United Nations took shape. And interestingly, when the United Nations headquarters was built, Le Corbusier was actually involved. And he wrote, several years later, he wrote a memoir about his experience with that. And he found himself reflecting back on his relationship with Paul Otlet, who he referred to as Saint Paul. They had a very close, very dear relationship, and he had a great admirer of Otlet. And he talked about how, for him, the spirit of Otlet really, was part of his mindset when he did his work with the United Nations. And he made this remark that he hoped one day that this would be the beginning of the realization of the world city. I think he said something like a wandering Jew. I hope one day this world city will find a home. And so I think we still see a very real, tangible manifestation of Otlet's spirit at work, even today, even though we may not be aware of it all the time. But I think the echoes of Otlet are sort of everywhere. And, I found it fascinating to really, learn about the really, truly expansive nature of his vision. And for me, it's helped me sort of kind of reframe my understanding of some things and occasionally, spark some new thinking. And I hope some of you find some of this stuff at least as interesting as I do. So if you're interested in learning more, I wrote this book about him. And that's what I had to say. So thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, great. We have time for a couple of questions. Yeah, we have time for some questions. Yeah.
Can everyone hear me now? Thank you very much, Alex, for your lecture. I learned a lot. The links with architecture and the links with Google that were the first time explained so clearly to me, and the differences and the similarities. We'd love to take some questions, 15, 20 minutes, before opening it up to a drink. Anyone to break the ice? No? It's always the hardest, the first. So maybe I don't know. Delphine, you have a question? No? I have a question.
Yourself on the spot.
Sure. What do you think Otlet then would have thought of Google?
Oh, you are putting me on the spot here. I think he would have appreciated the underlying spirit of Google's mission, to organize the world's information. I think that certainly would have resonated with his idea. I think that the fact that they've been able to come as close as they have to achieving that goal, which is ultimately an impossible goal. You will never collect all the world's information, but it's worth trying. So I think in spirit he would have been very aligned. I think, but again, I think the big difference is for him it was not a commercial enterprise. And I think that's the big difference. I think that the fact that just as a matter of its business model, of course, the search algorithm is going to be proprietary, right? Whereas in Google's in Otlet's world, it would have been transparent, right? How he would have built a server farm with no commercial activity, I'm not sure. Well, he got pretty close, right? I mean, but it would have been a much more of a state-funded. That would have been the difference. It would have been something that happened out of the nonprofit sector, and as we know, that's I think even his experience showed that getting things to happen in that way is not, at that scale, is a challenging thing to pull off. To really get that level of international cooperation between governments to something that ambitious is not easy, but that was his dream.
Yeah. So closer to Wikipedia, sure, in a sense.
For sure, Wikipedia is, I probably should have mentioned that, yeah, much closer parallel, because they are a nonprofit, they are publicly funded. I think what's different about Wikipedia is that it is so, in some ways open. Like, it's not as open as it used to be, but in theory, anyone can edit. I think that where it's different is that, Wikipedia does not really have a classification system around it. It's really just a very flat collection of articles that anyone can contribute to, and I think it's amazing how good it actually is, how reliable it actually is, but what it doesn't do a good job of, in my view, is really helping you understand the kind of relationships between different pieces of information, sort of cross-referencing or finding related content. It's very good if you want to just go deep in one topic, but it doesn't give you that ability to jump into other topics or to sort of cross between domains, which is very much a big part of what Otlet's system was designed to accomplish. So.
Yes.
Yeah. What about the privacy issues that you might have encountered when you had all the technology that's available?
So the question, it's a very good question, I think. What about the privacy issues? Did Otlet think about them?
I mean, I may turn to Boyd on this, who has read much more than I have. I have not encountered a passage of Otlet really talking about privacy in the terms that we talk about it today. I'm not sure it really entered into his vocabulary as a concern. I mean, he was really thinking about much more in terms of institutions and knowledge. I mean, he certainly thought about individuals having the having access to information. But really, even the idea, I think Boyd has made this point, even the idea of the user isn't really part of his vocabulary. The idea of like the individual kind of user of the system isn't really what he's talking about. He's talking about truth and knowledge and very lofty ideas and how a network of associations can support that, and there's a benefit to the end user, but he just has a very different sort of orientation to it. So he's not really talking about those kinds of concerns. And I'm not sure like sort of data privacy was even a concept.
Well, what would he think?
I
guess the question is, what would he think about the right to be forgotten?
Oh, jeez. I'm going to have to, I'll defer to Otlet
I don't
on
know.
That. Oh, yeah, okay.
He wouldn't talk about the right to be forgotten, but he would insist that nothing be forgotten. In the files in the Mundaneum are empty envelopes, torn up pieces of paper that he's not discarded, as well as all the other important documentation. His idea was that there might be ultimately some value to any of this stuff.
It is amazing going to the archives at the Mundaneum, just the volume of paper that he produced and the notes and the art. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, he just apparently never threw anything away. It gives me so much appreciation for what people like Boyd and Francois have done. I mean, I've dipped a toe in the water, but the volume of the archive is staggering, So,
No, I've seen it there. We have a little part of it here.
Yep.
And when you look downstairs in the Google reception, we have a part of the card catalog that we're on display, and you look at the details, and it's voluminous, every little thing. Yes?
It's about, coming back to the question about Wikipedia, the massive contribution we know today, anyone can post anything about any topic. And we consider that given Otlet's vision, which is quite, I read some books by Mr. Rayward, quite elitarian in some regards. Can we say that it was not, it was a kind of limit to, you said it's not really user-friendly after all. Consider that from that perspective. Some people have probably the right to express themselves, whereas others tend to be not neglected, but considered as...
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, he was coming from a different era, I think, where, it was just sort of accepted, I think, that there were institutional filters for knowledge and that there were these kind of vetting filters. I mean, it's just, I think just the whole concept that, like, of anybody being able to publish anything at any time. And I think certainly he saw the environment as being much more distributed and much more accessible in that way. But it's just, I think he was coming from, this world of bibliography and libraries where, like, things were published through the filter of, like, publishers and scholarly associations and universities. So that was just his frame of reference coming into it. I think it's very easy to sort of project backward to the way we think about it today, which is, of course, we can all publish things, but I don't think it didn't come up. It's like, yeah.
That's what I mean. It's a question, just going further. For instance, the concerts, you made a reference to that in your book with the like buttons, small audiences and wide, probably
for sure.
How are they chosen? I know it's very, well, very hard question.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that is true. He did have this idea that anybody could sort of, as he put it, applaud, or sing in the chorus or participate in some way. But I think that was a little different from actually, like, publishing something. I think it was just, to be honest, he didn't really, flesh out that idea in a lot of detail. I mean, it was kind of a remark that it's in there somewhere, but I wouldn't say that he really, specced out or, described the whole system around it in that much detail in terms of how, like, how people would be chosen to participate in the system or that sort of thing. But certainly he saw, again, or associations, institutions being a big part of the publishing process, anyways.
Yeah, and still, look, the internet gives anyone the ability to publish. I'm sure many of you are tweeting or blogging about this, but at the same time, Alex, you wrote the article in the New York Times, which was the one that got you started and got us to notice what you were saying.
Well, I guess,
and the book is published by Oxford University Press, so there's
I think institutions still have a role in things. Yeah,
newspapers still count.
But things still much more open than they used to be. Yeah. Yep. Oh.
Well, as we know that Otlet as well as La Fontaine had some affinities or sympathies with anarchism. Mm-hmm. How can this be rhymed with, in fact, a rather centralized view they hold?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, that's a very good question. It's certainly worth knowing that Otlet and La Fontaine both had sort of very left-leaning views about things. I mean, they were definitely very socially progressive. Otlet was very, one of the reasons I think he eventually lost some support from the Belgian government is he began to support things, host forums on sort of progressive topics like women's liberation and things like that. He was a known pacifist. How do you reconcile that? I don't think it was like he took an argumentative point of view against like individual like agency, people being able to publish things. I think it was just more like kind of an assumed constraint or something, I guess. That's sort of the best answer I have. Yeah. So yeah.
No, it's interesting also how the Europe's left is acting now towards the internet. So I don't know if there would be a connection.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic.
A whole other topic. So,
just wondering, do you think that Mr. Otlet will have loved to live in our century or be scared? Because from what I understood, he loves to make hierarchy, to put things in the right place. Mm-hmm. Where today we live in a world where we said just put everything on the table. And use a search engine.
Right. Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think he may have been. You might say he was maybe in some ways a political anarchist, but not an ontological anarchist. He was, right. So, what would he have thought today? I mean, I think he would probably be sort of troubled and frustrated in some ways by the kind of complete openness and anything goes. I think it would possibly. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, I feel a little uncomfortable speculating what Monsieur Otlet would have really thought about things. But if I had to guess, I think he would probably be a bit put off by the complete openness. And I think one of the big challenges I think on the internet is just it's a sort of state of perpetual amnesia. Like things you can't pin them down. Like things are published and then they disappear and they're not really archived and there's no permanent record. It's very like there's maybe the Internet Archive and that's about it. But it's very hard to like really keep track of things. And I think that would have probably driven him crazy. I mean, it drives me crazy. So.
Some more questions? No? Okay. I think thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Alec.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
I think now there's some refreshments in the back.
Great.
Please go and enjoy and continue the conversation about Otlet or internet or other things.
Great.
Thank you.
Cool.